Greetings, all you intelligent and compassionate people. I'm really excited to see such a large group here to explore and learn more about seeking the sacred in science. My name is Mason. I'm one of the co-directors of the Chapman Health and Healing Club, and we are co-hosting this event with Dr. Kumar and Dr. Kafatos. I could give you an introduction on both of them, but I'm sure you all probably read the flyer. Instead, I'll give you just an experience that I've had with both of them. I've taken 3 courses now with Dr. Kumar, and last semester I took the Quantum Theory, Cosmology, and Consciousness class with both of them co-teaching. And what an experience, let me tell you. You are very fortunate to be here for just an hour and a half. Well, I had the pleasure of being with them for 3 hours, once a week only for a semester. And the two of them are really such a dynamic duo in complementing each other. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that quantum theory principle, complementarity. So I invite you to keep your minds open and ask a lot of questions because these two have a lot of answers. So thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to just first start off by giving a bit of background as to what we're going to be doing today. As Mason very nicely introduced us, Dr. Kafatos and I have been friends, colleagues, and people who are just inspired by wanting to discover what reality is. And really ways in which we can be, we're mystics. We're really mystics in disguise. We're mystics with PhDs is what it is. and we decided to do this course together, Quantum Theory, Cosmology, and Consciousness, about 2 years ago. And we didn't have any idea how it was going to fly, and the only department that would actually offer it was religious studies. And so we said, well, you know what? If religious studies is going to offer it, if you create it, they will come. So we had a really amazing class doing this first time. Did a second time around last year, and I see actually a number of students from some of our previous classes that we taught in the past. And so this whole topic, seeking the sacred in science, it's something which actually kind of came out of this course that we teach, Quantum Theory, Cosmology, and Consciousness. It also comes from a couple of courses that we teach independently. As Dr. Kafatos will say just a bit, he really is the scientist, the physicist. I really have more of the background in religious studies and science, but also a bit of brain science and a bit of the Eastern mystical traditions. And tonight's talk really is going to be a dialogue. How are we going to do this? We're going to each kind of speak for about maybe 20 minutes or so. And then we decided we're going to open up to a dialogue, have a conversation. Because I know many of you, students and just people who are just inquisitive to be here, might have some thoughts or maybe some ideas or maybe some questions you want to pose to us. So we're going to leave the last half hour or so for just really an engaging dialogue. And this is really what it is. We're really trying here to create a larger dialogue that really begins to see, is there a possibility, or is there even a remote possibility that science and religion can actually coexist? Not only just coexist, can they actually enhance each other? Can they complement each other? Can they really begin to offer a new paradigm for us to begin to see how we can maybe, as a species, as humanity, begin to evolve into our next phase of evolution? And so, by the way, for those of you who do want, this entire presentation is going to be online at my website. I just created a subpage on my website, drjkumar.com/sacred in science. So if you would like to download this presentation, you're welcome to do so there as well. But it fundamentally is really about religion and science. Even though the title of this talk is called Seeking the Sacred in Science, this really could be a talk on religion and science. Is there a sacredness found in science? Is there an ability in which we can begin to see that science, or do science and religion express complementarity? You're going to hear more about complementarity from Dr. Kafatos a little bit later today. But basically, we live in a world, really in which we're governed by stories and narrative. And so a phrase that I always like to share with my students, or even when I give these lectures, is that the power in the solution is equivalent to the courage behind the question. The power in the solution is equivalent to the courage behind the question. We're here today, not just the two of us, but all of us are here today, and I'd like to think all of us are here because we want to ask this courageous question. That question is, do we have the courage to actually ask this question? Can science and religion, traditional adversaries or maybe traditional polarities past few hundred years, can they coexist? That's the courageous question. And so the way in which we can begin to seek a better future for humanity and for us really is begin to ask this question and seeing ways in which we can begin to find that common unison, that common voice between science and religion. And so I'd like to start off by kind of framing this evening, or for the part of what we're going to be talking about today, in the notion of a paradigm. And so I have to say, a paradigm is always built upon and reinforced by a collectively agreed narrative. I use that word narrative with meaning. A narrative is nothing but a story. It's the way in which we kind of look at the world. Here's the great thing. Science and religion fundamentally feed a common human question. And that common human question is, why are we here? What's the meaning of the universe? Fundamentally, we humans are meaning-making creatures. We seek to find meaning behind phenomena that we can't understand. So, for example, our ancient ancestors, maybe 10,000 years ago, they saw a solar eclipse. It maybe terrified them. They sought a meaning behind it. So they may have attributed a concept that there might have been in ancient Chinese tradition. The narrative was a dragon came and swallowed the sun. Okay? Science comes along a couple millennia later and says, no, actually what's taking place is that the orbit of the Earth and the moon and the sun together are causing this eclipse. Both are equally valid answers or ways of interpreting a phenomenon that originally was inspired by attributing meaning to something which is ineffable, something which is unknown. It's this drive, that begins to fuel our very essence of who we are as human beings, irrespective of religion, race, gender, etc. We're all commonly unified by seeking the sacred. And when I say the sacred, I really mean something which can't be properly explained, or maybe perhaps a better way of saying the sacred is, to give an example, we all, in our own life, experience the sacred when we watch a sunset, when we see new life. Death is also a sacred process. But what I'm really going to get at is that the narrative, the way in which we kind of interpret the meaning behind something, the narrative. Religion does it one way through faith, through subjectivity, through inner experience, through perhaps engagement. Science does it through rationality, through facts, through objectivity. Neither one is equally more valid than the other. A nice way of saying this, or kind of phrasing this, is like, look at the brain. You got two hemispheres of the brain, the right, left hemisphere, which traditionally, have specific functions. On a very generic level, we can say the left brain tends to be the more rational, the more logical, the more factual, maybe the more mathematical, whereas the right brain tends to be more intuitive, tends to be more subjective, more experiential. But we need both hemispheres of the brain in order to be full human beings. The left and right brain work in complementarity. and so do science and religion. Unfortunately, the narrative that we have been living in for the past few hundred years has been driven by this misconception that religion and science have to be antagonistic. And sometimes we forget, as I said over here, sometimes the narrative becomes so opaque or so obscured over time. I mean, there's a reason going back a few centuries that we talk about in our courses that really begin to show that there's a history behind why science and religion historically have become so polarized. But unfortunately, what happens is over time, the narrative or the story becomes so obscured or opaque, it just becomes a matter of fact. And this now becomes an infrastructure, or what I call an operating system of a culture, a religion, or society. And so we're kind of framing this idea as that the narrative that we have been running in the Western world, I'm not including all humanity, all indigenous cultures, but primarily in our Western psyche, we have been driven by a narrative of separation, the most predominant being separation from universe and nature. I think there's a very strong human arrogance that believes that we humans are separate from and superior to nature. That's a narrative that's been driven over the past several hundred years, and we kind of just take it for granted. It becomes an operating system how we view the world. As Dr. Kafatos is going to talk about very shortly, there's a new narrative that's emerging, and this is what we're talking. This is the whole reason for this conversation that we're having, is to really begin to share a new narrative that is being written by the humans, that's being created by the human species, and this new narrative we hope will integrate science and religion, and specifically new principles in quantum theory that align very elegantly with many of the spiritual and contemplative traditions we'll talk about right now. So Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, has a really great quote. It says, "The next Buddha won't be a person, it will be a Sangha," that is the entire planet and humanity. If you don't know the word Sangha, it's a Sanskrit word which means community. So the next Buddha, the next awakened one, Buddha is a word in the Sanskrit language, it means the one who has awakened. The next Buddha is not going to be an individual. It's going to be all of us. It's the planet. It's the entire species. It's what Teilhard de Chardin calls the noosphere. The world's going to awaken into an entire collective. And this idea is that the entire human species is the entire human species is transforming in such a way that we are beginning to see that all aspects of fragmentation, separation, the narrative we have been driven by in our society or our Western psyche might not be valid. And there may be a new narrative that's being created, which is advancing the paradigm of interconnectedness, wholeness, and oneness, which has been around for many millennia, but only now beginning to be reaffirmed. So we really talk about this idea of holistic science. The idea is that all the scientific disciplines are really interrelated. And we're here at Chapman University, which is a wonderfully academically driven university, but still we find many of the disciplines to be separate. And what we're trying to do, what we advance in our course and our teachings is where do we find a commonality? And where do the commonalities in science begin to align with the philosophical traditions, the mystical, contemplative traditions as well. And what we're finding is that it's time to reframe the human narrative in a new global paradigm in which consciousness might be the missing link. So I like to say, shift just hit the fan, or shift just got real, and that we're experiencing a shift. Maybe the shift is taking place right now, and because we're so embedded in the shift, sometimes it takes an objective view, or maybe like a macroscopic view, to kind of see what that is. And I like to think that people in the time of the early Renaissance didn't call it the Renaissance. It was only called that until maybe a few centuries later. But in the same way, we're experiencing a global Renaissance. What if we're in the 21st century on the precipice of something much larger that begins to actually unify all humanity together with the planet in such a way that the new narrative that we're going to advance in our cultural human framework is about wholeness and interconnectedness. And this fundamentally is the primary narrative that has been around and still is existing today in many indigenous cultures, many ancient cultures, as we'll see in many spiritual religious traditions as well. So I'm going to talk really briefly about the sacredness in Eastern traditions. And I'm not saying that Eastern traditions are the only traditions that have this idea of the sacred or this new paradigm or new narrative of wholeness. We find them in many old world traditions, but for the sake of time and brevity, I'm going to focus on the early Indian traditions, which is something which I particularly know well, but also that's the only reason I'm using this as an example, but it really nicely aligns with many of the quantum concepts that you're going to be hearing about from Dr. Kafatos in just a minute. So let's look at some of these concepts. And by the way, I should point out by saying, how many of you here have raised your hand if you heard of the word called the numinous? Numinous. One or two people. Great SAT question. Like numinous is analogous to what, right? Numinous, the word numinous, comes from Latin numen, which means to bow, to revere, to be in the presence of the sacred. It is linguistically connected to this idea, well, I should say it's conceptually connected to this concept that we see in the Sanskrit word namaste. Namas means reverence or honoring. Te means you. So namaste means I honor the sacred in you. The numinous is really about understanding that everything in life is sacred. Everything. Even this, I'm sure you might have, even like this cup of tea, some way has a sacredness to it because it exists in the universe. Maybe you have a basic consciousness, we don't know. But the point is that we as humans, I think maybe in our modern 21st century world, we become so disenchanted from the sacred, or maybe disconnected. We actually co-blog a piece in the Huffington Post called Disconnected in an Overconnected World. And we talk about this idea that we're so connected on these guys that we sometimes forget the connections taking place all around us to the planet, to other species, to other members of our family as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the Eastern traditions, especially in early Hinduism. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of a text called the Upanishads. How many of you here have heard of the Upanishads or read about them? If you're in my class, I hope your hand is raised because you have heard about this. The Upanishads come from a very early spiritual tradition from ancient India that go back about 3,000 years. Very basically, I'm not going to espouse the whole essence of the Upanishads. I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of this, kind of frame it with what Dr. Kafatos will be speaking about earlier. It's based in this concept called monism. How many of you here know what monism is or heard this term before? A few of you as well. Monism is not the same as monotheism. The ancient Hindu traditions believed in the idea that, unlike in monotheism, where the Abrahamic traditions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam are monotheistic, mono meaning one, theos meaning God, there's only one God, and happens to be a male deity. In the Hindu traditions, which encompass not only Advaita Vedanta, but Kashmir Shaivism, the goddess traditions, all these traditions are monistic. Monism, unlike monotheism, where there's only one God, monism means there's only just one everything. Everything. Everything is just one. You, your dog, your cat, the caterpillar, the person you overtook on the freeway getting over here, because you were late, all those people were all just one. Everything. And so this idea of monism gets expressed in this very ancient concept called Brahman. Unlike the Abrahamic traditions where we see the concept of God or divinity having a gender. In the monistic traditions of non-dualistic Vedanta, Brahman has no gender, not male, not female, has no form, can't touch, taste, see, hear, or feel it. Senses can't perceive it. It is the supreme, and it's non-local. It exists all throughout space and time. And it fundamentally is the foundation of all reality. I'm not going to give away the punchline here, because Dr. Kafatos will probably talk more about this, but there are analogous terms that we see of Brahman that we see in quantum theory. And I'll add this point. I think Dr. Kafatos knows this as well, and some of you took the quantum theory class know this also. Many of the noted quantum physicists of the early 20th century, Bohr, Oppenheimer, Schrödinger as well, they all were versed in the Upanishads. They all knew the concept of Brahman, and some people theorize that it's out of their knowledge of their monistic tradition of the Upanishads, concepts of quantum theory were, evolved, or maybe advanced. And so there's a strong parallel going on here. And so what I want to do is talk about this idea of Atman as well. I'd like to do this maybe with an analogy or a metaphor. And some of you who've taken class with me know this, so you can just bear with me again here for the 50th time now. This idea is that think of Brahman as an infinite ocean of consciousness. And just think of an ocean, okay? If I were to take this cup, luckily I have a cup here, if I were to take this empty cup and go to the ocean and fill this cup up with water from the ocean and take it back to my home and taste it, it would taste salty, correct? If I put it underneath a microscope, it would have the same molecular compound as the ocean, right? All of you would probably say yes. Think of it this way. If I were to take 7 billion empty cups and go to the ocean, fill them up, the substance inside every single one of these vessels would be identical. Raise your hand if you agree with that. Yes, okay, right? Okay. Why is it then that we see everyone else as being separate from each other? It's because our mind and our consciousness wants to focus on the vessel, not what's inside the vessel. What's inside the vessel is Atman, an individuated, specific, localized expression of Brahman. What's inside your vessel? What's inside your vessel? What's inside my vessel? What's inside Adolf Hitler's vessel? Or Barack Obama's vessel? Or anyone else you can think, even your dog, your cat, is identical. Because what's inside the vessel is Brahman. It's the water from the ocean. So here's the thing. Your vessel might be tall and skinny. My vessel might be kind of shorter and a little wider. Your vessel might be glass. Your vessel might be aluminum. Your vessel might be clay, green, polka dot, little peeling on the side, whatever the case might be. The thing is, we're trained in this narrative that we have been brought up to believe is real. We've been trained in this narrative to only focus on the externality of the vessel, while forgetting what's inside the vessel is the ultimate reality, which is identical in everything and everyone. That's Atman. So what's inside your vessel is the Atman, which is a localized experience of Brahman in this space and in this time. Quantum theory, which I'm going to have Dr. Kafatos talk more about in a few minutes, advocates precisely what the monistic traditions of the Upanishads and Kashmir Shaivism have talked about, and the goddess tradition have talked about as well. Everything in the universe is just one. How can that be when my mind sees you, me, and everything else? That's the illusion. And so the Hindu philosophers talked about this idea of the illusion of separation. This illusion of separation has been the driving theme of the narrative of our scientific traditions for the past 400 years or so. And this idea is that we are forced to believe that everything is separate from each other. But in reality, what quantum theory is now saying aligns with what the many of the traditions of the world have always been saying. We are here to awaken from the illusion of separation. We're here to awaken from this illusion, which in the ancient spiritual traditions was called Maya. Now, fortunately, I've had, from years and years of academic study, I've been able to learn and read Sanskrit, which is the ancient Indian language of Hindu philosophies and the early spiritual texts of India. The word Maya often gets translated as illusion, but if you really begin to explore the root of this word Maya, it comes from a verb or a word which means to limit. It's a limitation. So Maya really and truly is a limitation how we perceive the world. It's a cognitive limitation that restricts perception into a veiled, conditioned, subjective view of reality. It's the same principle of Maya that encourages and perpetuates this idea that you're separate from me, that I'm separate from everything else, or that what I do has no effect on you. And we're finding that no longer is valid in terms of the new principles coming out of a new science. So Maya, really ultimately, this idea of this Maya being this source of our cognitive illusion, cognitive separation, is the fundamental disease of humanity. I use that word, it's really strong. I'm actually teaching a course this semester on health, healing, and wholeness and science and religion. And we're really beginning to see this idea that health is a metaphor for wholeness, and disease is a metaphor for fragmentation, separation. And linguistically, we can actually show this. If I had more time, I would. But we can see, just in this example over here, that Maya, this cognitive limitation, is the fundamental, pervasive illness that has been plaguing humanity for centuries. And so it really is grounded in this idea. We experience Maya when we believe that Atman is not Brahman, that our individuated self is separate from Brahman. So I use this very simple algebraic equation, probably the only one I'll ever use my whole life when I speak, but I'll leave that mathematics stuff to this guy over here. But basically, if you go through life in this conceptual framework, thinking that Atman, your individual self, is not Brahman or the same as anyone else's, that's your suffering, that's your disease. That's the ultimate disease we need to start finding the cure for, to heal. And so the cause of suffering, we suffer when we perceive ourselves as Atman not being Brahman, A not equaling B. We experience liberation when we see everything as Atman is Brahman. That fundamentally is it. Very simple algebraic equation. We can resolve the suffering and illnesses of humanity the moment we begin to abide in a cognitive framework where we know that Atman is Brahman, that we are divine. In fact, there are many phrases in the Upanishads, I'll go through just a couple of these, called the great teachings, called the Mahavakyas. And in the original Sanskrit, they are Aham Brahmasmi, Prajnanam Brahma, Tattvam Asi, I am Atma Brahma, I am Brahman. It may sound really arrogant, maybe for someone here in the West say, I am God or I am divine, but not so in many in the monistic Eastern traditions, because everything is Brahman. And to think of yourself as not Brahman, that's the crazy part. That's where you get locked up in the institution, when you think you're not Brahman, okay? But everyone needs to understand they are Brahman. So these four key phrases, understanding is Brahman, that you are, and this self is Brahman. All these things advocate the fundamental equation that A equals B. Everything is interconnected, everything is one. So there's a wonderful phrase, I hope you can read that. There's a wonderful phrase in the Upanishads, from the Mundaka Upanishads, that say all rivers ultimately lead to the ocean. All rivers merge with the ocean. And that is, it doesn't matter what river you follow or take, whether it's Christianity or atheism or even Judaism or whatever the river might be, every one of us ultimately merges back with the divine in our own way. Your river might be a little slower than mine, or might be a little more windy, or might be a little more circuitous, but ultimately we all get there. So I'm going to just quickly just show you two passages from the Upanishads before I turn it over to Dr. Kafatos. But it's a nice segue to what he's going to be talking about right now. And it kind of encapsulates this idea how in the early Upanishads, the early Hindu philosophies and spiritual traditions, this idea is that we are interconnected. So I'm going to read you the Sanskrit over here. Yatha nadyas syamvyamana samudre astam gachanti namarupe vihaya tata vidvan namarupad vimuktaha paratparam purasham upaiti divyam. Say that 10 times really quick, right? So it translates roughly as just as flowing rivers disappear in the ocean, casting off name and form, even so the knower, the individual Atman, liberated from name and form, which is what Maya really is, attains the cosmic being higher than the high. So let's kind of look at this in one quick specificity, just before I turn it over. Just as rivers disappear into the ocean, when we realize that we are Brahman, we kind of we kind of reframe our whole cognitive perception. We kind of lose a sense of being, not in a bad way, but like in a very empowering way. A sense that we lose off our sense of identity, or ego, if you will. Raise your hand if you had a spiritual experience where you just felt this overwhelming sense of just feeling a oneness with the universe. Okay? That's exactly what we're talking about here. It's not talking about death. It's talking about liberating from the Maya, the disease of separation. And so, fundamentally, what we need to understand is that every single one of us, in our own way, has the ability to overcome the illusion of separation of the Maya. And what we're going to be advancing just shortly is maybe a way in which this can now be brought into reality, into more practical, everyday form. The last quote I'm going to share with you before I turn it over is this idea of really being able to look at the world in a whole cosmic vision, in a whole new cosmic way. And maybe the new paradigm that is emerging is going to enable us to begin to experience a cosmic view of reality. And again, I quote a passage from the Upanishads, Na pasya mrityum pasyati narogam nota duhukatam sarvam ha pasya pasyati sarvam apnati sarvashaha. The one who truly sees / knows, I'll talk about that in just a bit, does not see or know death, nor illness, nor any distress. One who truly sees or knows Brahman achieves the state of wholeness entirely. In the Sanskrit language, the verb to see can also mean to know. And how many of you here have heard the stories in the New Testament or in the Gospels of Jesus curing the blind? You've heard, raise your hand if you've heard those stories of Jesus curing the blind. Okay. What's really interesting is that in the New Testament, if you read the New Testament in the original Greek, it would actually say Christ healed the blind so they could Christ healed those who could not see. But here's the thing. If you read it in the original Greek, it's ambiguous if he was curing physical blindness or spiritual blindness. Or maybe it was both. Who knows? When people say, I see the light, It's not saying they were actually blind. They see the light of God. They see the light of divinity. They've awakened from the Maya. They become Buddhas. They become the awakened ones. And this idea is that when we know, again, it's not just the physical sight, it's knowingness. It's a cognitive vision. It's a cognitive perspective of reality. That is when we begin to understand that we have the ability to awaken from this blindness. It's almost like saying, in many ways, the narrative that we've been living under for the past few centuries is a narrative that's been based on separation, but also maybe one of like maybe amnesia. We forget who we truly are. We forget our true essence as divine, as divinity. And so what I'm going to advocate, as I turn it over to Dr. Kafatos, is that many of the spiritual traditions of the world fundamentally are driven by this concept that we are one, we are whole, we're interconnected. We see it in Christianity in the term of the logos, the word. The word unifies all of us together. Sound does as well. We see it in the concept of, in Eastern tradition, of the Tao. In Taoism, the Tao is the whole. It's Brahman in the mystical traditions of ancient India. You call it Christ consciousness. You could call it Buddhahood. There's many words for this. But fundamentally, we're awakening, we're remembering. Maybe the new paradigm that's being advanced is remembering there is a sacredness. There's a fundamental foundation of the mystery. And it's that mystery, again, we are human, we are meaning-making creatures. We are meaning-making creatures. We're driven to attribute meaning to phenomenon that we can't explain. Science did it does it through objectivity, through facts, through experimentation, to falsification, in ways in which religion does it more through experience. It does it through the subjective, through the numinous. And so a nice way to maybe close this is by saying, how many of you here have ever visualized the beauty of a sunset? Most of you probably have. That was a given. I hope all of you raise your hand on that. But can you prove to me that you have a memory of that sunset? You prove to me that you had that. I like to think there are some limitations or some areas which science still cannot breach. And that breaching, or that sanctity, that aspect of the soul where the sacred resides, that unifies all of us, that place of the Atman, that's the place where traditional science has not had the ability to do so. But as you're going to hear right now, perhaps there's a new paradigm of science that actually advocates the ability for us to appreciate, to experience the sacred and seek it. So with that, please invite Dr. Kafatos to come up. Oh, wow.
Oh.
Okay. Thanks.
So how much time do I have?
8:30. We can go. Yeah.
You got 30? Okay. Good evening. How are you doing? Okay. So, my side of the talk is not about seeking the sacred in science, but about seeking the scientific in the sacredness. Because it works both ways. The sacred can be put in objective form. Can I hear me? Is this on? It's better? Aha, there we go. So, we're all here. And what we're talking about is the obvious. But of course, there's really the first person, and just bear with me, well, get a little bit technical, the first person experience, the third person, and the second person. The first person is your own experience, your own everyday experience. The third person perspective is, we call it science, the objective part. And then we don't talk much about the second person. Second person is the one where we share reality together. And today in consciousness studies, there are big fights going on about, oh, is it the first person or the third person? And they forget there is the second person perspective, namely the view of reality that we share with each other. And until they tell me how they do that, I don't think they have a theory of consciousness. I really don't think they do. So Jay talked a lot about the Upanishads and the great tradition of India. And indeed, they really got it down to scientific, very scientific terms. I was not joking when I said, let's explore the scientific part of the experience of sacredness. Because if it was not objective in some ways, we could not talk about it. We would not be able to share it, right? So academics, I'm one of them, you know, we tend to, in the old days, they were talking about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. Actually, I like that idea. We should go back to that. Today, they're not talking about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. They're talking about theories of consciousness. And it's the Tower of Babel, right? It's pretty much Tower of Babel. It's so funny. So I would like to go back to the old ones. And I always like to put a face to some of these great teachings. And I will, if you bear with me, I'll talk about some of the ancient Greeks, along, of course, with the great masters of India, such as Shankara, Advaita Vedanta, who really taught the non-dual aspect of Vedanta, Vedanta being the whole philosophical system that followed the Vedas, the ancient teachings. So I'll start with Socrates. This is the man right here. Socrates. He was a very ugly man. He was. He was a great philosopher. He was a funny guy, and he used to joke about himself and about his wife and the hard times they had together. And he said he became a great philosopher because he had such a hard time with his wife. In fact, one time he was teaching, his students, and she got angry. I forget her name, by the way. What was her name? Anyway, she started throwing things at him, throwing pots and pans from above. And then he wouldn't budge. So finally she took a big bucket of water and just threw the water over him and said, well, after the thunder, here comes the storm, the water, the rain. So he was joking. But what Socrates said, and I will read it also, it's important to read things in the original language. So I'll read it to you in Greek. It says, en ida oti uden ida. So this is the greatest teaching of all philosophy. It says, one thing I know is I don't know anything. Okay? And he had huge arguments with the sophists. The sophists were the philosophers. Actually, they were the wannabes. They were the ones that were not philosophers. They were trying to become philosophers. So they would argue about the nature of reality, et cetera, et cetera. And one of them, I think his name was Protagoras, told Socrates, Socrates, you always keep talking about the same thing over and over again. Same things over and over again. And Socrates said, but you sophists never talk about the same thing twice. In other words, he's saying, you guys are all over the map, and I'm consistent. So the greatest teaching of Socrates is that one thing I know is I don't know anything. And if you think about it, how really do we know what do we know? How do I know what you know? As soon as I ask that question, then I go to the second person perspective. How do I know that, what's your name? JJ. How do I know what you know? That was the question you asked before. How do you know what I see? So he was not joking. Actually, he was pretty much on the money. Another great philosopher of ancient times was Heraclitus, or Heraclitus, as sometimes is known. He was very ununderstood. He was called the Dark One, not because he was dark or because he was evil or anything like that, but because the things that he said could not be understood very well. And this one is a little bit longer, but I'll read to you in Greek. Ta onda iene te panda και μένειν ουδέν, πάντα χωρί και ουδέν μένει. This est ton αυτόν ποταμόν ουκ am εμβέης. Let me read the last one. This est ton αυτόν ποταμόν ουκ am εμβέης. You cannot step twice into the same stream. Every time you step into the water, it's different. So Heraclitus, or Heraclitus as we call him in Greek, was probably the first quantum physicist, quantum philosopher, because he realized that everything flows, everything changes. Everything moves. And let's experience that right now. Let me ask you to just where you are. Don't close your eyes. Don't need to do any meditation. Just where you are. Just pay attention to what's happening around you, whatever it may be. As soon as I said that, there's a stillness, right, that descended. And in that stillness, at the same time, you experience that everything is changing. Your thoughts are changing, your breath keeps going on, your blood keeps circulating. Everything flows, and yet everything is the same. But you cannot step into the same waters twice. So what the human mind, what Professor Kumar was saying, Jay was saying before, it's the human mind. It's the human mind that wants order, wants things to remain the same, not to change. And our own experience says this is bull. It's just the biggest bull that anybody has said, and it's perpetrated by our own minds. Our own minds perpetrate on us the biggest bull. It's a great philosophical statement I just made. You can quote me. You can say that we went to this talk, and he said that the biggest bull is perpetrated by our own minds. But really, think about it. Everything is created by the mind. The entire universe is created by the mind. The mind is very powerful. The mind is very ununderstood. The mind is our greatest friend. The mind is our greatest enemy. The mind is all there is. And the mind is the one that binds us to a limited sense of who we are. I am not advocating getting rid of the mind. Far from that, I would be fooled if I did say that. What I'm advocating is to use your mind the way it's supposed to be used. It's a great tool. You have it. You're a human being. Use it. But don't become a slave of the mind. Your mind will drive you crazy. I don't care how much money you have, what possessions you have. If you lose your mind, What do you have? Really? He says, I'm losing my mind. If you lose your mind, you lost everything. I experienced some great beings in India 2 years ago in a village near Mumbai. They had nothing. I mean, literally, they were walking without shoes. The dirt. Their mind was as sharp as it could be. And they had this big smile on their face. You see one of them? Say, aha. This person is liberated. What does it mean, liberated? Liberated from the clutches of the mind, folks. There's no liberation out there. It's just remembering who we are. The mind creates duality. The greatest duality is quantum theory. Bear with me, we're going to get a little bit deep here. And whenever we talk about quantum, everybody says, oh no, that's not for me. 50% of the economy of the world, folks, is based on quantum theory, okay? This contraption here that you all have is based on quantum theory. Nuclear reactors, atomic bombs. Your brain operates because of quantum theory. Photosynthesis, now scientists have proven that photosynthesis works because of quantum effects. So photosynthesis, which is the base of all life, is a quantum phenomenon. So I would submit to you it's not 50%, it's probably 100%, but let's be conservative, let's say 50% of the world's economy is spun by quantum theory. So it does affect each one of you, each one of us. And this view of quantum theory says that, as the French say, les apparents trompent. The appearances are not the real thing. So in the top diagram, you have a situation where something that we call a wave passes through one slit, through two slits, and then into the screen, and you get bands that are called interference. Susan, there's a book right next to you under your purse. If you just pick it up, you know, The Conscious Universe, just hang it up, and you can look at it afterwards. This one, right. So there I explain what is this double slit experiment. Quantum theory says that the reality is contextual. What does that mean? It means that it depends on what you're trying to measure. In this case, you're trying to measure the wave aspects, and you see the waves. In this case, you're trying to measure the particle aspect, and you see particles. And the human mind says, no, it's got to be one or the other. How can something which is localized be the same thing as something that is wavy? The mind, remember? These games, these questions are formed by the mind. How many times have I going to tell you tonight? Watch your mind. The takeaway tonight is watch your mind. The biggest friend, but it can also wrap you around. And unlike the spider is a cool animal, right? The spider creates, what do they call? Nets. Spider net, and captures insects. In the case of the mind captures itself. It's like a spider that captures itself. It can never get out of it. That poor spider will never be able to get out of itself. So here is a deep question. If the world is quantum, which means it's all entangled, wavy, and if you can pass around the book, you can look at one of the books. If it's all of that, how come it looks as separate? The question that Professor Kumar was asking before. Despite what the Upanishads say, that everything is Brahman, how come we don't experience it as Brahman? How come we don't even experience an Atman? We experience it as you and me. I and you. And by the way, it's always I that's most important, right? Right? Come on, let's be honest about it. It's you and me, but it's really I. It's me, right? Right? Come on, you know that. Oh yeah, equality, we're equal. The mind says, no. Moi. Me, myself. Separates. Why? I have no idea. I'll be honest about it. I have no idea. They say it's the great play of God. It's the great play of consciousness. God gets bored being alone and says, you know what? I'm going to create myriads and myriads of universes. Myriads. Myriad in ancient Greek means 10,000. Billions, trillions, billions, would be Carl Sagan, right? Forget Carl Sagan. Trillions. How many universes exist according to quantum string theory? The latest count is 10 to the 500. 10 to the 500 universes. Actually, this is not the highest number. There is another number, 10 to the 10 to the 10 to the 7. 10 to the 10 to the 10 to the 7. Wrap your mind around that one. 10 to the 500, if you were God, okay, and you said, I create so many universes, this is crazy. Did I do that? 10 to the 500 universe? I got to find out each one of them how they are different from each other. So I have 1 second. I'm all-powerful God. I'm going to give myself 1 second to study the laws in each one of these universes. Okay? 1 second for this universe, 1 second for the next one, 1 second for the next one. In the age of this universe that we live in, you know how many of you have gone through? 10 to 20 of them. Not 10 to the 500. So this is crazy. What kind of quantum theory is this that predicts so many universes? We only have really one universe to study, and it's all the spooky mind, as it says here. The mind is spooky. Einstein said, spooky actions at a distance. I tell you tonight, it's the spooky mind that makes everything look so crazy. It's not the universe or the quanta, it's the mind. Come back to it. Maitreya Upanishad. 3 principles. Let's go through the 3 principles. The first one, complementarity or integrated polarity. Everything in the universe has its polar opposite. You want good? Good luck. You got to have bad. If you did not have bad, quote unquote, you will not have good. I'm not advocating bad. I'm not advocating evil. Heraclitus, the same guy, because of the Trojan War and all these big wars. By the way, things have not changed. There's still wars going on all the time. same old, right? They were praying to the gods, to the 12 Olympian gods, if they would just take away the suffering and stop these evil wars. And Heraclitus said, you don't understand, my friends. You're praying for the end of the universe. Because take away the positive or the negative, the other one disappears too. Complementarity. Recursion. What you see here repeats at every level. If we didn't have recursion or correspondence, as we're going to call it, we wouldn't be able to talk to each other. If whatever is going on inside you is not going inside me, there will be no way for us to talk to each other. We could not even communicate. And by the way, this statement was actually made by one of the great Shaivite masters, Kshamaraja, who in the 11th century AD said, you know, if indeed the ground of everything was not the same for everybody, we would not be able to even communicate. He was actually talking about the second person perspective. He was talking about the second person perspective. If we didn't have the same ground of understanding, we wouldn't be able to communicate. The third one is process, creative interactivity. And they're all like the Trinity. They work together. The third one, we seek each other. Sometimes we don't seek each other. It can be negative interactivity. We sense, we interact, we build bigger things. We break down bigger things. The opposite. All three of them work together. The three principles is what I call natural laws. Not law of gravity, not law of, the opposites attraction or like that. Go to the principles behind the principles. Go to the principles behind the laws. These are the three fundamental laws of the universe. For example, on the left side, you have a brain cell. On the right side, you have a simulation of clusters of galaxies in the universe. They look the same. I'm not going to tell you tonight that clusters of galaxies are like neurons in the brain. I cannot prove that to you. But they look awfully much the same. They look the same. This is a neuron, and this is a big galaxy connecting through other galaxies, in this case, connecting through other neurons. This is a manifestation of the second principle, recursion. But it's also a manifestation of the third principle, of interactivity. Because this interacts with its neighbors, and this interacts with its neighbors. And it's also a manifestation of the first principle, complementarity. So let's stop for a second. Take any one of these principles and just contemplate it for a second. Any of them. See what happens. And let's share very quickly after that. Okay. Anybody want to share? Which one came up for you? Anyone? Don't be shy. It's only the mind. Rachel, tell us. Which one came up for you? She was struggling with her mind. Yes. Third natural law. Yeah.
Everything's always changing and reacting.
Right. Thank you. What's your name? Candy?
Hannah.
Thank you. Was it by itself, or did something else come up with it as soon as you thought of it? Or did it come up by itself, or did something else come up right after it?
It was through experiences, how when you interact with something, things change.
Right.
Just thinking how the whole concept.
So she said, I was experiencing how it changed. So she experienced the change. But she also experienced this happening at many levels, right? So in fact, if you contemplate any of these principles, thank you, by the way, you will see that they come together. So the ancient Indians and the ancient, not so ancient, Greeks, and then the modern philosophers, Spinoza, Immanuel Kant, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Alfred North Whitehead. These are not great mystics, but in some sense they are great mystics. They're philosophers, they're Western philosophers. And they reach more or less the same conclusions as Adi Shankara or Kshamaraja or Abhinavagupta, but from a different perspective. They talked about the pure reason. They talked about the pure reality, going beyond the mind. So we can use different languages, but we're all talking about the same thing. As Socrates said in answer to the sophists, Socrates, you always keep talking about the same thing over and over again. How boring. And he said, well, you guys never talk about the same thing twice. So indeed, we talk about the same thing. We put in our own language, our own traditions, our own experience, but it's all one thing, and that is experience. Albert Einstein, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind, 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 blind. Either bland or blind. Same thing, right? It's blind. And it's also bland. So Einstein was saying you need both, complementarity. Everyone who's seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that the spirit manifests in the laws of the universe. For Einstein, it was Baruch Spinoza that was his idol as a philosopher. The rationality of the universe. So we scientists seek the rational. But there is, as Heraclitus would say, the irrational. They're both there. So the axiom that now we're reaching, one fundamental principle. You keep hearing of the theory of everything, forget it. Theory of everything? Who even ever thought of that? Theory of everything? We don't even know how our mind works. We don't even know how our eyes work. We don't even know what happens at night when we go to sleep. And we're talking about the theory of everything, and we're coming up with 10 to the 500 universes. We don't even know what a universe is. It's ludicrous. It's games of the mind. And scientists are in love with their minds. Their own private little minds, not everybody else's mind. First person perspective. Axiom. Monistic fundamental awareness is the underlying reality of the universe. Monistic, as we said before. Single vision. So let's finish by experiencing this monistic awareness in each one of us. Do I have another slide? Ah, yes, let me show that one, because that's actually how the mind creates the universe, and then we'll go back to the unity awareness, okay? So here, as Jay said, we have a veiling principle. Actually, by the way, we just, Subhash Kak and myself, who's also a quantum physicist, we just got a paper accepted for publication in a physics journal, straight physics journal, where we talk about the veiling of reality caused by what? We say just there's a veiling principle that hides. We believe that mathematics, and I'll just say that, not more than that, and actually comes out with some really fundamental mathematics. It's called algebraic geometry. Okay? When you break the symmetry and you say, I am not that, aham brahmasi, right? I am that, I am Brahman. When you say, I am not Brahman, then duality is created. I am not you. I am not. It's a game of the mind. I am not that. Then the infinite becomes finite. The one that has no desire has many desires. The one that is omniscient is lost, has to take courses, has to go to Chapman or LMU or USC and take courses from people who are, I can say one of them, mostly ignorant. Mostly ignorant people. We take courses from each other. And what is infinitely free becomes bound to cause and effect. Then space becomes limited and time becomes finite. And then we are finite human beings. That's the bad news. The good news is that monistic fundamental awareness is the underlying total reality. That's the theory of everything. You heard it tonight. You are that. Don't try to look for answers outside of yourself. You are going to go nowhere. You are going to be a miserable human being. And you may even lose your mind. You may even lose your mind, the one precious thing that God gave you. So, and by the way, you can put it in a formal way. We'll now begin to put it in a formal way. We call it the formal lens for fundamental awareness. But let's finish, because we really want to open it up. So I would like you to ask you to just sit back comfortably. Just put your feet on the ground. Sit back comfortably. And don't try to empty anything. Don't try to empty the mind, because, by the way, you can never empty the mind. So don't, just sit back. Just watch what's going on here. Is it going on here, or is it going on here, or where is it going on? Where are the thoughts? Where are the thoughts coming from? So I will ask you to be aware of the one who is aware. Just pay attention to the one who is always there with you, has been with you from day one. You know who he is or who she is, right? It's you. Just pay attention to the one who is aware, and be aware of the one who is aware. Don't force anything. Don't try to exclude anything. Just be aware of awareness itself. That's you. That's it. There's nothing else. There really is nothing else. That's the amazing thing. After so many years of studying science, I've come to the conclusion there's nothing else. It's so much right in our face all the time, right here. We don't see it. The one who is aware is you, and you are there all the time. And there's nothing else. The first person perspective, the second person perspective, the third person perspective are all the same, the one and the same. There's only one. Whether you call I am, or whether you say you exist, or whether you say there's something out there, it's all the same. Let's have some questions. So, thank you.
I wanted to.
We took up so much time of your time.
We did.
Sorry.
We did.
Sorry.
I'm not going to go through the emerging narrative. I think that's something we can all discuss together. I kind of like this picture over here. We need a revolution based on love. We'd like to jump to questions, but for those of you who want, we're making this presentation available online, and if you want, you're welcome to just go to, I posted my website, drjkumar.com, Sacred and Science. Dr. Kafatos and I have also published together in a new journal, a new issue of the Cosmology Journal. A lot of what we talked about here can be read in that as well, and our Huffington Post blog. Disconnected and an Overconnected World. And you can also keep up with us by staying engaged on social media. And this really is an opportunity, as we said here, to create a dialogue. And so we're giving you this information so you can be part of this dialogue. be part of the Sangha, to be part of the awakened, community that's taking place here. And so we've got time where we'd like to maybe just open it up, maybe 15 minutes or so, and just kind of have a Q&A, like anything here, that questions or thoughts. Yes, tell us your name.
How can I have a question when all my questions have already been answered because the answers have come from within me? I
Yeah.
expect an answer from outside of myself.
You're not getting an answer, getting a discussion. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's the human condition.
Yeah.
How do I get the answer if I always look at, Good point.
How many of you here, just raise your hand, believe that it's even possible that we as a species can evolve to emerge into a new paradigm of thinking? Great. The shift already hit the fan, right? It happened in this room. But how many of you here, just maybe just a question, how do you see that happening? Or what are ways in which you see that taking place in your life right now? What are some ways in which you see that manifesting? Yeah.
I think you see a lot more academics sort of moving into the realm of thinking more spiritual, encompassing instead of just academia and thinking of our mind. There's this whole idea of wellness and well-being for students. You have things in colleges that have programs like these.
Right.
You have USC doing Mindful USC.
Right.
UCLA dealing with neuroscience and how do you have mindfulness-based practices. You watch Oprah, who had, I think this Sunday, had John Cabot
Zen.
talking about mindfulness. You have
We're just talking about it.
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
and so you have a lot
Tonight.
of dialogue, even though mindfulness is sort of thrown out there. I think it begins the conversation for people to lift up consciousness. There's a vibration that's happening, and I think people are responding because we're in a system that has so much technology and disconnect that we are trying to find a way to connect.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing, I know we have some neuroscientists in this room tonight, but one thing that I'm going to maybe just say, which about the brain in particular, and Dr. Kafatos and I said, there are these limited conditions in the brain and they prevent us from feeling connected. But I think fundamentally, the brain is a social organ, and we need to connect. It evolved to connect to each other. But I think what's taking place now is that our circle of who we deem to be part of our tribe, if you will, our social tribe is expanding. And so this idea is that, traditionally, historically, the social tribe was only those people who were in your immediate clan, maybe your family members. Then that evolved into people who were maybe of your same religion. And then eventually the notion of the nation state came along, and the social tribe was anyone who was part of your national identity, German, Japanese, Korean, whatever, American, Greek, Indian, etc. But now what's taking place, maybe for better or for worse, through the advent of modern technology, we can now in real time connect with any person, well, most people who have internet connections. We can connect with almost within a second or two, okay, pretty instantly. What if like the next paradigm we're moving into is that we're expanding the notion of what the social tribe is. It's moving away from clan ties to religious ties to national identity ties, moving into something which is a global and maybe even cosmic. The idea of seeing ourselves as being part of a larger cosmos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just need to make sure. I am a fan of Alan Watts. What Alan Watts was talking about 30, 40 years ago is what you're talking about right now. That opened the realm back in the late 60s and very early 70s to the whole idea of the real you, is what he calls it, and the whole idea that everything is one, and that this running around and seeking answers all over the place from different philosophies and religions
Right.
from all different cultures and religions are beginning to get that it's spun way up into this idea of all things are one. Old idea, but now generated in such a magnificent way. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with the idea that the Mahabharata, the great
War.
Indian
Indian War.
right,
Yeah.
that it glorifies violence in general and war, of course, in particular. I'm still struggling.
It actually doesn't glorify war. It exalts doing your duty in the world.
Yes.
So it actually, for those of you who don't know, he was talking about the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, which is an excerpt of the Mahabharata, which was written about 2,000 years ago, roughly. That is an epic war story about two sets of cousins who are battling for rulership of the kingdom. And for those who study Hinduism with me or study Hinduism, the question I'll really answer is that the epic does not glorify war. It reveals that the most important thing to do in the world is your duty. And in the Hindu philosophies, the warrior caste's duty was to defend the tribe. So it was more so about honoring the Dharma and honoring the balance of justice in the world. And by the way, in that story, the war was done as a last measure. It was not the first measure. So, yeah.
And also, it is a manifestation of complementarity. Complementarity.
I was wondering
Yeah.
because it was mentioned here that we cannot have the good without the bad because of the world. So does that mean that we'll always be experiencing war because it cannot be disentangled from peace?
On the other hand, we have a choice. We do have a choice as free human beings to also not do war.
It reminds me of, I'll get your questions to it. It reminds me of a really wonderful poem by the Sufi master Rumi.
Rumi.
I think it was Rumi in the 12th century, has this beautiful poem in Persian where he says, a man goes out into the street and he sees hunger, he sees poverty, he sees violence, he sees hatred, he sees violence, he sees dissolution, he sees all these atrocities, and he cries out, "Oh great God, how can there be so much evil in the world?" And God responds, "I made you." That's the response. I made you. And so it fundamentally boils down to something Gandhi eventually says almost 800 years later: be the person you want to be. Be the person you want to see. I'm not getting the quote right now, but be the change you want to see in the world. Be the change you want to see in the world. And it really boils down to this. We have great power. If there weren't a Rosa Parks, if there weren't, Martin Luther King, or like Elie Wiesel, we didn't have these people in the world, evil would predominate. So there is a balance. And I think what we're advocating here, that every single one of you here in this room has the potential to be part of this new narrative. I say this in a really wonderful way. This idea of a narrative, cosmology is really another word for narrative as well. Cosmology is how we look at the universe, how we perceive the universe on a greater level. A cosmology is a form of narrative that science advocates. The narrative in religion might be a creation myth. In the Bible, the Quran, or the Vedas, for example, or indigenous traditions. But I like to think that in some way, we are all writing the script of this new narrative. And we don't really know how it's going to end. But there are 7 billion protagonists in this new narrative. And you are a protagonist in this new narrative. And this is why we're having this dialogue. Yes, go ahead.
Well, it's just interesting in that when we think of polarity,
Mm-hmm.
we think about good and bad. In order to recognize good, we have to have an idea of what's bad and so forth. When we talk about peace and moving into this direction, when we talk about Brahma, when we talk about Atman, we talk about this underlying what's in everything. It's in everything. You can't be separated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting concept
Yes. Awareness.
Absolute silence where there's no longer any duality. There's no longer good, there's no longer bad, and not quantified by I, but truly shared universally in a collective consciousness where we become that still. And where dissolution, and it's kind of it's a weird thing because you're getting into the space of, and there'd be no dissolution any longer. There'd be no birth, there'd be nothing, it was just right? So where
You got it. Back there.
Yes, sir. I couldn't help thinking when you were talking about and universal forces on the concept of forces.
The forces of what, Ari? Star Wars.
Oh, Star Wars.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the Force is basically, it's the Tao, it's Brahman. In fact, George Lucas was heavily steeped in Indian philosophy.
Right, very much quite interesting tool of mass education. The other thing, you know, you're touching on the Gita.
Uh-huh.
I understand Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer,
Yeah.
the head of the Manhattan Project, at the detonation of the Trinity test,
Right.
was noted to say, I am become death,
Destroyer of worlds.
A million suns. A million suns. A million suns. Yeah. The atomic flash was a million suns. Yeah. So he.
Right, but he quoted the
But he called it the Upanishads.
the Upanishads
Yeah.
in that. Well, what I was getting earlier, like many of these noted quantum theorists in the early 20th century, Bohr, Oppenheimer, Schrodinger, I'm thinking of some others as well, I can't remember their names, but you know,
Pauli.
Pauli was Wolfgang Pauli, another big one. Carl Jung also, for
Carl
that
Jung.
matter, from in the psychology field. They were all heavily versed in monistic philosophies of the Upanishads. In fact, if you look at their correspondences that they wrote back, this, you know, of course, this is before email, so we just like we actually hard copies
They actually have
of all of these
letters.
correspondences and letters they wrote back and forth to each other. They talk about quantum theories, you know, quantum theory and everything, and they talk about, and this passage from the Upanishads kind of summarizes what I'm talking about, this whole concept of quantum theory. You know, how many of you here have heard of this concept called entanglement? Maybe you can maybe talk about what that, for those of you who don't, what is entanglement?
Entanglement is the manifestation of non-locality. So you might say, well, okay, so you're talking about, you're defining one term with another term. Basically, entanglement says that two quanta, two particles of, they can be particles of light or electrons or protons, when they're separated, they are, initially they're in a particular state, quantum state. When they're separated, they still remain in that quantum state, no matter how far away they are from each other. And if you measure one property on one, the other one instantly responds, as if they were connected outside of space and time. In fact, they are connected outside of space and time. That's the explanation of entanglement. And what we did in this paper that it just got accepted, we're saying that actually non-locality is veil. Non-locality is veil, because if it was not veil, all you would see is a gigantic wave of everything being together. And that's, of course, it would be Brahman, right? You would be experiencing Brahman all the time. And for the sake of creating the universe, non-locality is veil and appears as separate objects. So non-locality gives rise to entanglement, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Do you think that some to the dialogue that started, I mean, obviously I can tell you in the year 6 program, is really this resurgence of yoga. People starting to inquire about Patanjali's sutras, which is a little gentler way of coming into maybe this kind of realm, Samkhya, the Upanishads, the Rig Veda. People are now sort of going backwards, understanding that these great philosophers were somewhat influenced
Yeah, I'd like to maybe respond to that. You know, how many of you here have go to a yoga class or have a yoga practice? Which you probably be, or you know, what you may not know, as you were saying, Loyola Marymount University is one of the few. It's the only university in the country that has a graduate program in yoga studies, where they not only study yoga philosophy, but the physical aspect, but also the therapeutic aspect of yoga as well. And so yoga, we've always been kind of accustomed to think it's just a physical practice. It's actually not. The word yoga is a word in the original Sanskrit, which means union. It's actually connected linguistically to the English word yoke, as in to yoke two horses together, two oxen to connect. It's also linguistically to the Latin joint or juncture. It's that same concept as well. Yoga means union. Well, what is a union of? It's a union, in some ways, it could be the union of the breath with the body. That's one maybe basic fundamental way. But, you know, I think, you know, with what we're saying here, quantum theory is really what the scientific equivalences of yoga philosophy is.
Yeah.
And that primarily is that yoga is about oneness. It's a state of which in samadhi, which the closest equivalent of the word is synthesis in English, where everything is just one. And it gets to something that Dr. Menas was saying earlier about entanglement. When two particles were once together and they're separated over space and time, let's say over space, they can be, if you affect one, they affect the other instantaneously, beyond what Einstein's, you know, speed of light, if you will. But here's the thing to think about. Where did all of this come from originally, according to what we think of, according to modern cosmology? A singularity. So guess what, folks? We're all entangled.
We're all entangled with
We're
each
all
other.
entangled. All of our consciousness is all entangled.
We're all entangled.
But the reason why we don't, and we experience this sometimes, actually, I like to think we experience cosmic, we kind of experience non-local consciousness beyond space and time, all of us in our life. And you know when that happens? When you sleep and dream, okay? It's there. But,
So in fact, the great Patanjali, he described meditation as the stilling of the modifications of the mind. He didn't say, you know, lose your mind. He said, slow it down. Just make it still. Like the waves, when the waves become calm, that's through meditation.
yeah.
Matt.
I'm glad you touched on that because when that happens, as frequent as it does for me, that calmness, it's profound, it can be, but there's also aspects of my mentality that I really enjoy. You know, eating for acceleration.
Yeah.
Where you have similar experiences, but with your duality, I mean, things beyond the calmness that you're still enjoying.
Yeah.
Can you talk about it?
What do you want to talk about?
I mean, I suppose there could be a great ideal where you're searching for the Brahman stillness,
Yeah.
right? But it's still fun to drive fast or to
Tell-
live in this dual nature.
Yeah. It's a great bliss, right? To live in this duality, right? That's why it's going on, because it's,
Disease-ridden as well, but
yeah, it depends. Complementarity, yeah, it can be great. I mean, after all, you know, if there was no duality, vive la différence, right? If there was no duality, there would be a very boring world. But taken to extreme, complementarity, then it separates us from each other. So yeah, indeed, it's unity in diversity, unity in duality. That's the secret. Unity in diversity.
We're probably going to have to wrap it. It's already past 8:45.
Yeah.
But we thank you all for coming. And if
Thank
you have
you.
questions to ask us individually, you can. But thank you.